Hello, everyone, and welcome back from spring break. I'm back in my classroom and ready to get going on some more videos. So what we're going to be doing is going into our fourth unit, which is on the medieval church. And I'm actually going to be spending some time in an area of history where most of us don't spend any time, and that is the so-called Dark Ages. Not so Dark Ages, fun fact number one. The height of witch hunts in the world actually happened in the 1600s during the Enlightenment. Most of us just call it the Dark Ages and say nothing happened there and we move on. But again, this is just a myth that was started by a Renaissance writer that kind of took hold, and all modern historians disagree to even calling this the Dark Ages. Um, but we're going to be looking at the medieval church, and our main question in this unit is going to be, how does tradition develop? Tradition is handing on what we have learned, but as times change, the tradition needs to change, not within its core, but rather sometimes how it is presented. What does true tradition look like, and how can the church change and yet still remain true to who it is? It's really this question of, how does an organism grow, right? How does a tree move from an acorn into an oak tree and yet remain itself the whole time? Later on, we'll be looking at some failures of the church and look at how can the church be holy yet imperfect. But today's video is going to be on the city of Jerusalem and the growing split of the East and the West. So this is kind of a history-heavy one, and I'm a bit of a history geek, so I'm kind of excited about this because I usually don't get to talk about this.
That's his eager face.
But the city of Jerusalem is fascinating because we don't really understand all that's happened to this city. Now, for Christianity, this is one of the most important cities out there because this is where Jesus died, but also because it is the most important city for Judaism. And as we saw, Christianity comes out of Judaism and cannot really be separated from it. A couple things happen that are pretty significant to Christianity. The first is in 70 AD, there is a Jewish revolt which leads to the destruction of the Jewish temple by the Romans. As we saw earlier this year, there's a big drama between the temple of the church, right, the body of Christ, and the physical temple. Well, with the destruction of the temple, there no longer is a physical temple, and so Christianity kind of becomes the temple. There no longer is this draw from Christians to go to the Jewish temple. But 65 years later, you have another Jewish revolt, and this one is more serious, and the Romans completely raze Jerusalem to the ground. They destroy it, and they kick everybody out of the city. This becomes what's known as the Jewish diaspora, where Jews are banned from Palestine, and they are banned from ever entering into Jerusalem again, and they are sent as exiles throughout the entire world. While this is happening, Rome just wants to get rid of any remembrance of Judaism. They're tired of their revolts. And so they actually renamed the city of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolonia. The Romans did a pretty good job of wiping Jerusalem off the earth. The city, again, is completely destroyed, left in ruins, and the only people that remain are a small group of Christians. No one else really remains in the city, and the Christians start to rebuild. 200 years later, with the Emperor Constantine, thanks to his mother, St. Helena, Jerusalem starts to be rebuilt. Constantine really focuses on Palestine and wants to build up the Holy Land. Unfortunately, Constantine does retain the ban on Jews from entering into the city, but really from 135 AD, Jerusalem is a Christian city. And after Constantine rebuilds the city, you see a spike in pilgrimages and people wanting to see the place that Jesus died, to walk where he walked, and to pray where he prayed. And by the year 500 AD, this city has exploded. Its population has increased by at least 5 times, and it is one of the most important Christian cities, and still is to this day. Now, Jerusalem is what's known as one of the 5 patriarchs, that is, the 5 most important cities. And we've already talked about three of them. So you have Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, and the other two are Antioch and Alexandria, and we're not really going to go into why that is. But I want to point something out on this map. Each of these cities had a sort of pope-like bishop in it. These 5 cities had the 5 most important bishops, and so all of the decisions of the church would come through these 5 cities. Rome, of course, is seen as the most important, but notice how Rome is the only one in the Western Empire. The other 4 are all in the Eastern Empire. Well, as we saw, Rome fell in 476, but with that, the question is, what happened to the Roman Empire? The Roman Empire doesn't actually go away. It remains in the East, and the capital of the Roman Empire is Constantinople. You can actually see in 565 a map of the Roman Empire, and it still retains a good chunk of the Western Empire land. The issue is all of it is under the Eastern Emperor. So as a recall, we're going to see some more drama between the emperor and the church. So before the fall of Rome, we had 2 emperors, one who was in charge of the West, one who was in charge of the East. But with the fall of Rome, the Western line ends, and the Eastern Emperor becomes the emperor of the entire Roman Empire, which, looking back, we called the Byzantine Empire. They called themselves Romans. Now, we talked about the emperor's role in the church, and as we saw with Ambrose and Theodosius, in the West, the emperor was subject to his bishop. The bishop could tell the emperor what to do. The emperor could not tell the bishop what to do. But what about in the East? The Western Empire is gone. What about the Eastern Empire? Well, as we're going to see, it's a little different. And this is why it's really important to note that 4 of the 5 major patriarch cities are all under the Eastern Emperor. And with this, we look at Pope Martin I and Maximus the Confessor. So a little context, it is the year 649 AD, and Pope Martin has just called the Council of Lateran, which is held in Rome. It is held at the Church of St. John Lateran, which was that first church that Constantine built instead of sacrificing to the gods. And the question is whether Christ has one will or 2 wills. Does he have a divine will only, or does he have a human and a divine will? Now, this again is that question of Christ's 2 natures. Is he truly human? If he doesn't have a human will, is he really human? Well, a lot of this comes from this guy Maximus the Confessor, who starts asking these questions. He was born in Palestine, and in this time, the Eastern Emperor had required all of his citizens to say that Jesus has only one will, only divine.
Son, have you been reading heresy recently?
But Maximus has an issue with that and says, well, if he doesn't have a human will, is he really human? Essentially, if Jesus doesn't have a human will, he has no ability to sin. And so it seems that Jesus needs a human will and a divine will. You can see how this is sort of a repackaging of that question of Nestorianism about what does it really mean that Jesus has 2 natures. And so the Pope in Rome calls a council without the permission of the Roman Emperor, who is in Constantinople.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
And so all the bishops show up, and at this council, they determine that in order for Jesus to be fully human, he has to have a human will. Now notice, this is in direct contradiction to what the emperor required everyone to do. So the question is, who's going to win? The emperor or the church? The pope or the emperor? So Pope Martin sends out an official decree in the teaching of the church, and they say, Jesus has 2 wills, human and divine, right? To maintain that he truly is human and truly is divine. And so the emperor's response is very simple. He calls for the Pope's arrest. 4 years later, Pope Martin is arrested in Rome and dragged back to Constantinople. There, the emperor strips him before the whole city and then leads him through the city in chains. Thereafter, he is sent into exile where he shortly dies, and he is the last pope to be considered a martyr. Now, in modern days, both the Eastern and the Western Church acknowledge Pope Martin as a martyr, and both agree with his decision. But at this time, you can see there's starting to be a breaking of the Western Church and the Eastern Church, because the Patriarch of Constantinople, essentially the second in command to the Pope, does nothing, right? And watched his fellow bishop be martyred by the emperor. Maximus the Confessor is then arrested, and the emperor asks Maximus whether the emperor is a priest. He's essentially asking, can the emperor make decisions in the church? And Maximus says, no, you cannot. And so the emperor responds by sending him into exile and forbidding him from ever teaching again. Of course, Maximus ignores this, and he's brought back to trial, and there he has his tongue and hand cut off, so that he can no longer speak or write. As we can see, in the East, the emperor has a little more control of the church than in the West. Now, of course, the church is still united, all under the banner of Christ, and these 5 bishops really are the ones holding everyone together. But as you see, some tensions are starting to appear between Rome and the Eastern Church. We're going to see how later this leads to a schism between the East and the West that is still around today. But before we get to that, next class we will be talking about one event that completely rocks Christianity to its core, and this is the rise of Islam. So I hope you are all well. I saw that a number of you did not have your This Is Our Church book, and so what I've done is I've copied all the readings onto a PDF, and so if you don't have the book, you'll be able to still get them online. Otherwise, I just texted Dan, and Dan said he'd be interested in doing a Zoom meeting. So at some point, we're going to set up a meeting where if y'all want to meet the mythical and legendary Dan, he will be there. Until then, everyone, stay healthy and stay holy.